I'm gonna wait just one more minute to see if anybody else jumps on. Okay, I think we can get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Maggie Fleming, and welcome to GrowSmart Maine's Inclusive Transportation Forum. I am the GrowSmart Maine Board Secretary and our Events Committee Chair, and today's panel will be moderated by my fellow board member, Carl Eppich. And we have 4 distinguished panelists today: Greg Jordan, who's the Executive Director of Greater Portland Metro; Zoe Miller, Facilitator of the Moving Maine Network; Ryan Neale, who's a Policy Development Specialist with MaineDOT; and then Marcel Ntagora, Planning and Outreach Associate with Greater Portland Council of Governments. And we're pleased to have a broad group of attendees today, including from state, municipal, transit, and individual planning perspectives, and solutions come from these kinds of dialogue. I'd like to take a moment to honor the people of the Wabanaki Confederacy before we begin: the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Micmac peoples. These people are the traditional inhabitants of the lands of the state of Maine, and no matter where you're watching from today in Maine, you're on traditional Wabanaki territory. And thinking about your personal relationship with Maine and future opportunities for the state during today's webinar, please consider the relationship that members of the Wabanaki Confederacy have shared and continue to share with this place as well. So why are we here today? GrowSmart Maine works so that the communities and people of Maine will appreciate and practice smart growth to advance climate action, ensure equity, and preserve place. Equity is central to smart growth, and robust transportation options allow all people to access jobs and services, essentially to participate in society and the economy. So just to review the agenda before we get started, today's program will be 90 minutes. The first portion of the webinar will provide background information on the problem. The second part will address the smart growth connection, and then the panelists will discuss solutions, and we'll leave time for Q&A at the end. I encourage you to turn your videos on, but please remember to keep yourself on mute during the panel and raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question during Q&A. And I encourage you to type any questions that come up during the panel into the chat box. And just to let you know, today's webinar will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel later on. I'm now going to turn it over to Carl.
Hey, thanks, Maggie. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar this late afternoon. We had this idea to put on this seminar a while back because, really wanted to focus on one of the big barriers around smart growth. It's the two-pronged problem of affordable housing and affordable transportation. And, as it says in the introduction to this webinar, Mainers by choice or circumstance that do not own a vehicle have limited options, even in populated areas, never mind the more rural ones. And so we put together this panel of people from across Maine at the state level, Greg from the Metro and the largest transit systems in the state, Zoe, who's got a long history with equity and inclusion and planning and health, Ryan, long-term transportation planner, works for the state now, and Marcel, who specializes in planning and outreach to special populations. So what we really wanted to hit on first here, is really setting the stage for the problem. As I articulated, it focuses really around accessibility to transportation options, equitable jobs, access, livability, being able to choose where you live and be able to get around with transportation. And it's really, the major two-pronged aspect to this is that younger people struggle with the costs of living and access to transportation. Cars are getting more and more expensive, gas increasing. And transit is an obvious solution for many people in many places, but it's tough to deploy equitably and really to satisfy everybody's needs. So we wanted to kind of look at that from the standpoint of the investments in infrastructure and services the inequitable aspects of transportation and transit, and really kind of look at how different communities are impacted in the state. And so really from that, we're just going to walk through this with the panelists. I'll introduce a topic and give everybody a chance to chime in. The very first one is issues about accessing transit in rural communities, and it applies also to as I've already said, more urban ones. And so the big one is just high level, not a lot of time on this, but what transportation options are currently available in Maine, in urban areas and in more rural areas. And this one's really, I think, for everybody. I'll start with Greg and Ryan, just to kind of give us a picture of what we have for transportation options outside of the automobile, in urban and rural places in Maine.
Yeah, thanks, Carl, and thanks, GrowSmart Maine, for putting this on. This is a great forum. I really appreciate being a part of it, and I hope some good ideas get discussed and advanced, and we'll see. But to Carl's question, just setting the table for public transit, and I'll kind of cover more the urban areas of southern Maine, and maybe Ryan can kind of go on the more rural statewide piece of it. So broadly speaking, I don't think I'm surprising anybody by saying we do have the good bones of a multimodal public transit network in southern Maine. We have obviously the rail service, the Downeaster, that runs from Brunswick through Portland into Boston. We have a very robust ferry system here in southern Maine, but also statewide. We have, I think, what I would call a fair baseline level of bus service in the urban areas of Greater Portland and Greater Biddeford-Saco. And we have, I think, a fairly strong paratransit demand response service across southern Maine as well. And there are certainly other programs, mobility programs, nonprofit, private sector mobility programs that are in operation as well. But what I'm just describing here is sort of the core multimodal network serving southern Maine. It is nowhere near sufficient to satisfy both the current level of demand, both from people who truly need it, as well as those who maybe may make the choice to use it if it was going to be effective. It's also a fairly complicated network. We can get into some more of this maybe when we talk about solutions down the road. But I'll just sort of end by saying we have a good multimodal framework, which is great for a relatively small region. But the level of service and the level of coordination and the simplicity of it is something that we really need to try to advance. And that does have really significant implications for accessibility, availability to populations that truly need it, and affordability as well in terms of getting around, which we all know is less expensive than driving. So I'll also stop there and ask Ryan to take over.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Greg. I would just add that, all of us know that Maine is a largely rural state. Most of us, when we think of transit, think of sort of the fixed route transit where a bus or another vehicle is coming to a certain location, running a certain route at a specified time. That really works well when you have a critical mass in urban areas, the southern part of our state, or in more urbanized areas in cities around the country and around the globe. Once you get beyond that, that type of fixed route service really doesn't make sense as you're moving into a more rural, dispersed environment. So there's demand response service. Some folks are calling this microtransit, which is sort of an offshoot of that, where a vehicle comes to a given location at a given time. Or in some cases, we have areas of the state that are served by a vehicle that may make a run from one city or one town to another more urbanized area once a week or twice a week or something along those lines. And folks have to plan their schedules around that, which obviously presents some challenges. But, I think with limited funding and funding constraints, which will always be operating in public transportation, can't be everything to everyone, but we do hope to provide at least a minimum level of service to folks across the state. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention bike and pedestrian access as well. Not everybody needs to take a car or transit to where they want to go. For some folks, that's biking, walking, using skateboards or scooters or e-bikes, which are expanding the range of possibilities if folks have a relatively short commute to connect to where they want to be.
Thanks, you guys. The next question coming off of this is really okay, given these systems and given these services that we have in Maine, thinking about those, what options or what areas are most challenging for people to access transportation, or get from wherever they live to wherever they need to be? And can you give some examples of how these problems, what the reality of these problems are for people, how people out there really live these problems, and how some of the ways that they manage it? That's really for anyone. Maybe Zoe, you want to take a tackle it
Sure.
first?
Well, and I would love to just add to the,
Sure.
when we talk about the overall landscape of transportation, I like to talk about it as public and community transportation to kind of get at the pieces that are out there that include grassroots volunteer driver programs that we have in many communities, and are one of the less expensive and more realistic ways I think that we're going to get more rides to more people in rural settings. And we really have a whole array of innovations that are bubbling up now too around the country. And I think, looking at how we can use services that are, sometimes we think of them as just being market driven, like, so Uber and Lyft and the, transportation network companies, but there's a lot of conversation going on about how do we put those tools to work for nonprofit organizations. So we have cases of towns or cities where they're using municipal, say like the rec van that is, not being used on Sundays. And so then they're getting volunteer drivers to come in and offer rides. So there's some really interesting innovations, but as has already been noted, it doesn't work great for everybody. And I think one of the biggest things that comes to mind for me is the amount of planning that people need to do when they don't have their own personal vehicle. And so from the get-go, even though in some parts of the state, we're really fortunate to have a lot of transit, people still need to spend more time figuring out, planning their trip and allotting, maybe 4 hours where it would take somebody an hour if they were using a personal vehicle. We see situations where the connectivity between the being able to get to and from the bus stop isn't a reality for somebody who doesn't have is maybe intimidated by the crossings, or not able to get up to not able to stand up and wait at a stop. So I think we have folks are working on it, but there's still a lot of the pedestrian infrastructure and the bus stop infrastructure that is really needed. And as you get out into the more rural parts of the state where fixed route transit doesn't exist and probably isn't the solution, we have folks who really are, they're dealing with needing to make several, maybe a 40-mile trip or a 60-mile trip or more. And I think in those cases, people are much, there's a lot more going on with trying to match people with organizations that can provide volunteer rides. I know I saw there was somebody from the Cancer Foundation on this list. There's often folks having to travel way across the state to get to those appointments. And so there is a pretty robust volunteer network, but that's taken a big hit from between COVID and then the current worker shortage, sort of a perfect storm of gas prices going up, folks being dormant from their volunteer roles. So then organizations losing volunteers. So that's something I think is like a really important message for people to hear, is we need to get the word out about the value and the need of volunteering for those services that are still out there that could be providing more rides, but really aren't able to provide many rides right now because they're down so much on drivers.
Thanks. Thank you, Zoe. Anybody else want to chime in on this angle, this point? If not, I can go to some other aspects. Unpacking that, it's not just the dispersity of access, as we get less dense areas and where, fixed route doesn't work or fixed guideway doesn't work, but into areas that where the land use patterns really create physical barriers, whether or not it's a highway in the way for using something like microtransit, bicycles, walking, etc. I wanted to get at the heart of what some of the physical barriers are and gaps in the system, whether or not you're in an urban environment or say in a more rural area like or a rural area around Skowhegan or a rural area around Presque Isle. These are small towns, but they're more urban in context, but yet they may not have a what's called a traditional transit service as we all imagine it. How can we create a system that works, or what types of systems might work in those kind of half service center but very rural areas? Do you have any examples of services or creative ways that people are getting around, able to access services or jobs in those areas?
I'll just start. Oh, go ahead, Marcel.
Go ahead. Okay. I would say since GPCAG started to involve everyone in the transportation planning and decision making to advance the inclusion of underrepresented communities, we get to know many things because everything is about perspective. Unless you get to talk to people, underrepresented people or people with these challenges, you cannot guess the kind of challenges they face. So during our work with people with transportation barriers, we get to know how uneven surface or sidewalks is a big problem for those people, because everyone comes with different perspective. Everyone is different. People have different barriers, but most of them, some rural areas don't have public transportation. And then for people to come from like a remote rural area like Gray outside of Portland to come to Portland takes a long time for them to access public transportation. And in the back and forth, they need to plan ahead of time and then know that they will put in much time to access their destination. But also lack of bus shelters in the area, different locations, and even surfaces for people with disabilities. Those are big challenges for people to be able to access public transportation. Even on the intersections, there are big problems sometimes for people, normal people. They cannot see how challenging it is for someone who's blind or with limited vision to cross the street, or some people to see when the lights turn green or red. It's very difficult. So those are kind of small things for people to be able to access public transportation. Those are barriers in between, because from their home to the bus stop, that's also the built-in environment that can be a barrier from preventing someone to access public transportation. And then also the problem of bus frequency. For people who work, who would like to see more frequency on public transportation, they feel like it's not reliable. And then especially for those who work like night shift, for them to come back to go home, it becomes more challenge for them to access public transportation. So those are kind of, unless you put yourself in the shoes of those people who struggle, all the adult people who are losing ability to drive, and then thinking how to access public transportation, it's very challenging for them. When you bring them to the table, when you try to talk to them, that's when we can be able to see things from different perspective, because these are big challenges for our community members.
Thank you, Marcel. I'm not sure if anybody else wants to chime in on this angle at this point. Feel free to. The next, otherwise, what we're really going to look at next here is this challenge between, our current, getting at the heart of the smart growth angle is really our land use patterns. And, we've all heard drive till you qualify as far as purchasing a home or being able to, it's literally linked into our language and our culture that it's housing and transportation has to do with driving. And what I really wanted to look at here is in looking at the smart growth connection and inclusion is how do we think more about bringing together more closely where we live and where we work or where we shop, where we get services, really the economic implications, livability, placemaking between smart growth, transportation, and livability. We've always said that smart growth has equity baked into it, basically to provide opportunities, live, work, play, where you live, the ease of getting to your job, and doing things on your free time. And that's a little bit of entitlement from that angle, just thinking about these things from how we live, and those of us that don't have to think about it too much from a transportation challenge aspect, at least. And so again, who is likely to experience challenges related to the lack of options in transportation, again, whether or not it's the whole spectrum from train, bus, car, all the way down to walking and biking. And Marcel's kind of touched on this. And what are some of the short-term steps that will have the greatest impact for making car-free transportation more accessible to people who have no choice, through people who do have a choice and want to make that choice to either live car-free or be able to take trips without a vehicle.
Well, I'll jump in.
Yeah, go ahead, Zoe.
I'll jump in, Carl. Yeah, I mean, the Moving Maine Network, for folks who don't know, we're a statewide coalition that's focused on improving transportation access for everybody, but with really a targeted focus on people who have more barriers. And so, having spent time looking at data recently about who owns a vehicle, what households do and don't own a vehicle, it's not the ultimate measure, but it's a pretty interesting one. And what we know is about 7% of Maine households lack vehicle access. So that's 40,000 households. And, we know Maine being as rural as it is, that you can't just say, oh, well, that's people who live in downtown walkable areas. When you start breaking that out by race and ethnicity, we see that people of color are 13 to 15%, or 13 to 15% of households have zero vehicles, lack vehicle access. And then in some rural parts of the state and in some lower income neighborhoods, it gets much higher. So I know like Casco, which is very rural in Cumberland County, is 16%. And there's other places in Maine where it's, getting into the 18s and 20s. And so, I mean, I think that one of the things that we've been talking about a lot within the Moving Maine Network recently is this interface between slowing down our streets and our roads to make them places where people can be comfortable walking, because people need to walk. It's for many people, it is not a choice that they're making. They need to spend at least part of their trip walking or wheeling in a mobility device or riding a bicycle. And this issue, I think, sometimes gets seen as being kind of like a wealthy walkable neighborhood issue, but I think it ultimately it's like, let's slow down all of our roads, because they will then also be better places to wait for a bus. Frankly, it's a lot more pleasant to be waiting where you have, cars going 30 miles an hour than cars going 40 and 45. So, and that's not just, when we talk about that, again, it gets seen as urban, but I really think, as we're seeing with some of the work that MaineDOT is doing right now about village partnerships, it's rural too. We can make places in our rural parts of our state where you can have a bunch of uses in a village area, and then it becomes a more pleasant place for people, pleasant, safe, comfortable place for people to get to and from the places that they need to go on foot or by mobility device. And you do hear a lot of stories of people in the more rural parts of Maine who are piecing it together. So maybe they're getting a ride part of the way, but then they need to walk part of the way. And so those roads need to be places where people are comfortable being on foot as well. And there are ways, the good news is there are ways to do it, and it doesn't have to be really costly, and it actually then helps us meet our climate goals as well. So, one of the things that the Moving Maine Network is involved with right now in partnership with Grow Smart Maine and Build Maine is looking at what are the tools we need to be able to do that, and where do regulations get in our way, where do we need some different funding. And we've been having some great conversations as part of the Policy Action 2023 effort. And I think I feel hopeful about us being able to make the changes. But it is like some of my friends at DOC say, like turning a large ocean liner ship, because we have built out this system. And so it's incremental. So I like to say we need to be relentlessly incremental and take all the little opportunities to make it better. And I think, pairing that with what Marcel was saying about making sure that we're including the people who most need to be on foot and wheeling in our roads in the process, because people who are, living and breathing, being a pedestrian or a bicyclist, they can tell us where to start and where, we don't have an endless amount of money, but I think the more we listen to the people who most rely on those bicycle and pedestrian amenities, facilities, they can tell us what to prioritize.
I think building on that point, if I can jump in, and Zoe has said all the right things, I think we need to keep pushing a paradigm shift in how we plan and develop our communities. And that has to occur at the municipal level, obviously at the state level, but also really importantly in the minds of developers that are building residential, that are building commercial developments across the region, and are still building things with very much the car at the forefront of their minds, because all of the incentives for them are to continue building in that manner. And I think obviously the city of Portland and other communities in southern Maine, I think have come a long way in terms of trying to incentivize smarter growth opportunities and changing some of the incentives, allowing for more mixed use, allowing for more density along certain corridors, reducing or even in some cases eliminating parking requirements if you're more than within a quarter or a half mile of a transit line or a bus stop. So things like that is where, and that's the hard place where it's really complicated. And that's the cruise ship that I think somebody mentioned that's hard to turn. One of the things I wanted to point out about continuing to help make transit more affordable, because of obviously affordability and the cost of driving certainly, but even using public transit can be a barrier for many individuals. And I think one of the things that we have found to be successful here, again, in southern Maine, is continuing to advance what we call transit pass programs. And usually they are employer sponsored, employer subsidized, or school district or university or medical center. And that ends up putting a free transit pass, a free unlimited access transit pass in the hands of that student, that employee, that person, and really helps them get around. I mean, one of our goals here in Southern Maine is to keep expanding that opportunity out to get more free transit passes in the hands of the people who need to live, work, and play and get around.
Thanks, Greg. You know, you guys both touched on something and reminded me. I remember Avesta Housing in the Portland area years ago, and I heard this anecdotally, and I think it's their policy, is that they wouldn't build any more housing within, you know, all of that new housing that they would build would be within close proximity, walking distance of a transit line, or at least you know, some kind of connection to transportation, sidewalks, I assume. And I'm just curious, you know, and I'm kind of looking at you, Ryan, on this one. Is there been any movement in state policy, either on the housing side and or on the transportation side, working together to make investments, transportation investments and housing investments concurrently, so that we're creating this huge need we have for housing, also simultaneously has some sort of access besides automotive to a system that's just not just for cars. That's, you know, that would be smart growth. That's smart growth tenant. Just curious if there's any movement in that direction more on a statewide level.
Yeah, I think we've talked about it a bit, Carl, but you know, in some ways we're responding to decades of a certain type of land use pattern, but going forward, I think there are things we can do. I don't know that there's any large efforts at the you know, at a statewide policy level, but I think transportation certainly should be in that conversation of the land use discussions and development. And as Greg alluded to, you know, whether that's coming from local zoning or developers are doing this on their own, but you know, things like parking restrictions and you know, adjusting those if you're close to a transit stop. Some folks have probably heard me say this before, but some years ago I lived in Washington, D.C., and I didn't have a car. And anyone that's lived there or spent any time there knows you don't really want a car because it's really just a hassle. But when I moved there, my decision was I had to be in walking distance of a transit stop. And luckily there's a lot of transit stops around the district and the system works pretty well. But in some ways, I think we sort of need to have that that perspective where cars can be a challenge. And you see that a little bit in the Portland area where, you know, parking is a challenge. Finding a place to keep your car overnight can be a challenge. So in some ways that drives better land use decisions. And I think it's safe to say that MaineDOT, along with a lot of departments of transportation around the country, were primarily about transportation. And that was kind of where the conversation started and stopped. And usually that meant transportation in the form of a single occupancy vehicle. But, you know, I think we're certainly more open to some of these conversations, these other alternative ways for folks to get around. So we talked about the Village Partnership Initiative, where we're working with municipalities to really strengthen the community and make those communities a place that folks want to live, not just a place that traffic is passing through and folks are looking to move away from. So we certainly can't undo decades of, you know, what a lot of folks would call sort of misguided land use patterns, but I think we can look to make improvements, even if they're incremental improvements going forward.
Anybody else want to touch on that one? I know it's more of a statewide policy question.
Just one more thing.
Yeah,
I
thanks,
think
Greg.
to Ryan's point, I mean, it's making sure that mobility that are sort of not necessarily mobility in general and transit in particular are at the front of the conversation when it comes to how we develop, how we build, in conversations with developers. Because we're always, and historically, we've always been talked about last, or if something gets built and then we're approached about how to serve it with transit. That needs to be flipped.
Yeah, I agree 100%. It's making me think of all the times that a large organization makes a decision to change a location, and how do we have mobility and transit be on the leading edge of those conversations. I do think, you know, in terms of more suburban and rural settings, something that's on my mind that really connects to the, you know, the push to, the move to electric vehicles, and we have these challenges of if you live outside of, well, generally folks want to have a car. There's still very much a sense in Maine that you need, quote unquote, need a car. And for many places, I mean, that's largely true. And so how do we look at models for car sharing? Or I think I sort of have this dream picture of having a bank of a few shared electric vehicles in villages or in, by housing sites that could be put to use by different households at different times of the week. And there are models for it. I mean, I know that in Massachusetts, they have something going, and I believe in New York as well. So I think those types of setups can bridge to where, we're not there yet in terms of, if you say, okay, we're going to make it like impossible for you to have a car, or maybe it is impossible for you to have a car. We're not quite there yet with transit meeting needs. So we have people who really get stuck. And I think there's a lot of space for us to come into that with, okay, well, how do we have these smaller, maybe it's a flex route, maybe it's shared, car shares. There are solutions that aren't as big and aren't as costly, and yet will make it so not every family needs to own a car, which, by the way, is hugely expensive. I mean, I probably, I don't think that's lost on anybody right now, but the fact that people need to be spending, $300 and $400 a month to maintain a vehicle becomes just a huge, they've moved to where the rent is lower, but when you look at the overall cost of living there, it's actually higher. So people really get caught in that bind. And I think, looking at more ways for people to share vehicles, I think has potential. And I know that there's an effort through MaineDOT to promote people to share rides. So not necessarily sharing vehicles, but sharing rides. And that Go Maine has been updated to encourage that. I don't know if Ryan wants to speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Carl, if you don't mind, I can speak to that really
Please,
quickly.
please do.
Just backing out slightly, but building on Zoe's comment, I've also heard the phrase car less, not necessarily with no car in the household, but fewer cars in the household, or maybe you have cars, but you don't take them for every trip if you have other options available to you. So I think that's kind of an interesting notion. But Zoe mentioned the Go Maine program, which is one that MaineDOT runs in conjunction with the Maine Turnpike Authority. And it's a ride sharing and trip planning program, really connecting users to all transportation options around the state that are not single occupancy vehicles. So that could be links to the local transit provider, ride sharing, van pooling, and we're continuously building out this system. So at some point, as more transit providers move to automated fare payment, we'd love to be able to have that service available directly through Go Maine, or they can plan a trip from Fort Kent down to Kittery and connect to all those bus options that they need to connect through, and find all that information right on the Go Maine website.
And Ryan, what you speak about there, I think I've heard the term, or actually, I work with this mobility management, and I know that there are models where mobility managers, it's a position, sometimes it's distributed, and there's a person that kind of heads up an entire program for the state, and then there are more regional, sometimes embedded with regional planning organizations. You familiar with those models, and is that something that's possible here, or work happening in Maine, where mobility management, as I understand it, is linking up, working with people who are looking for rides, with people who can provide transportation, whether or not it's very small scale through shuttles or vans, and that seems like having focused on that, certainly at the more rural level, and doing that combined with perhaps some housing operators might be a really great. Are there any? Basically, my question really is from a GrowSmart stance or outlook. Are there examples of that anybody knows of in the state, or is that something that we're seeing here, either within the private or public sector? Anybody familiar with that?
Yeah, I can speak to that really
Thanks.
generally, Carl, and then maybe turn it over to Zoe or others who might want to jump in. But one of the problems we hear at a statewide level is that folks don't know about the transportation options that are available to them. So we're currently working on a statewide strategic transit plan, which will be out for public comment in the coming weeks. And as part of that analysis, we realized that public transportation at some level does exist for most of the state, but a lot of folks either don't know about the service or think it's for a specific population and not available to the general public. So just generating awareness overall of the options that are out there, I think, is a challenge and an opportunity. And Zoe, you may want to speak a little bit to mobility management. I know that's something that Moving Maine has been very involved in.
Sure. Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, and I would say that we hear that over and over, that there's a need for more promotion of what's available and to make the information accessible to people. And so Moving Maine really came to be originally about 4 years ago through the recognition that we need mobility management for Maine. And so we are advocating for regional mobility management programs in Maine, similar to what has been recently. It's getting rolled out in New Hampshire and other states, Colorado, Ohio. There's sort of a growing list of states that have staff people whose job it is to work with all the stakeholders in a given area to solve the transportation problems. And so, bringing people together across sectors to figure out what's the greatest need and then act accordingly. And I think in Maine, our best model for that is the Mobility for All program at GPCOG. Marcel and I started off working together for about 4 years ago, and I'll let him talk a bit more about some of what they do. I would say in the bigger picture, that program, when we first started pulling people together and assessing what the needs were, we heard people don't know what the options are and more options are needed. And so one of the first things that we did was look at, well, how do we make information available to people, and how do we meet people where they're at? And so it's been pretty exciting to watch those programs go. And so I'd love to let Marcel talk a bit about the Bus Ambassadors program, which really looks at the needs of people who don't speak English or it's not their most comfortable preferred language. And some other travel training work, which travel training is kind of a wonky term, but basically saying, like, how do you get the word out to people who need rides about what their options are?
Thank you, Zoe. So here at GPCOG, because of this, the problem of people have a problem of accessing public transportation or knowing which available mobility options for them. GPCOG started Mobility for All programs, which are playing the role of mobility management in the region right now. We created many programs, but the ones that are helping really to help people understand the system and then access transportation resources, but also to be able to be comfortable to navigate the system. One of those programs is the Bus Ambassadors program. It was created because of the idea of advancing the inclusion of underrepresented communities so that they can advocate for their transportation problems. And then from that program called the Community Transportation Leaders, the Bus Ambassadors was born. And then this was more specific for newcomers, new Mainers who don't understand the transportation system, but also people with limited English proficiency. So the program was designed to receive referrals, people who, agencies, organization partners, or individuals can reach out to us, and then request a ride with a bus ambassadors, because we have multilingual volunteers who are ready to help people to navigate the system to move from one place to another, but also they teach people how to plan their trips to, and this way people, new riders, understand the system, but also they gain confidence to be able to ride, to use public transit by themselves. The other program is Travel Helpers. Travel Helpers is more, it's a kind of, they are similar, but it focuses on patient navigators and case workers, staff of human service organization and healthcare agencies. We train them, we give them the skills about the system, transportation system, so that they can be able to help support their patients and then and the clients. So we recently partnered with MaineDOT to do the training. They are also continuing to provide the training, but the overall goal was to help people in the region, newcomers and the residents who are losing ability to drive, anyone who's willing to use public transportation, because that's the goal, to encourage everyone to use public transportation. This program provide the skills, but also help new riders to increase independence and ride or navigate public transportation safely. Out of these programs, also we have these key documents that we created that help people with all inclusive information about public transportation. We also provide transportation, translation and interpretation of materials so that people can access those resources. Yeah.
Thanks, Marcel. I want to touch a little bit more on this idea of both the programmatic side, this mobility and management aspects that we're talking about, and then also the built environment. Again, housing, where housing is, transportation services, and what types of programs and partnerships. How do we bring in underrepresented communities into the transportation decision-making process in places, outside of Portland, in places, and not just underrepresented, but also, a range of ages is really where I'm going with this. It's this problem is of access to transportation and living in places where things are walkable and accessible is both at the younger set and, as in one of the oldest states here for the older people. And are we familiar with any models in the state or initiatives beyond the ones we already talked about, or things that are being thought about ways we may provide a voice and a platform for people to kind of vote on what they're looking for, see something that can fulfill all these needs for a diversity of people.
Yeah, JPCOG has been doing this to make sure we advance the inclusion of everyone to have a say, because all the decisions that are made on about transportation affect those public users. So we do our best to include them. We have the Community Transportation Leaders Program. This is our first program that we started with Zoe was still with JPCOG. We started by connecting with different partners, organizations, different community leaders, because this category of people were very hard to reach. We leveraged the connection with our partner organizations and the community leaders. We were able to recruit many people who are passionate about public transportation, other adult people with disabilities, people with low income, immigrant and the refugees, newcomers. So many people were able to join this program. We created flyers, translated those flyers, but also we used all the tools like WhatsApp to communicate with community leaders to help us reach those people. And then most of the community leaders in the region, because our region is very diverse, they refer the people to the program. And then when they get to this program, they get trained, but also they identified problems they face in their region or areas, and then came up with solutions that they presented to our big committee, regional committee, for approval. Then we supported them to solve those problems. And then the good thing that happened because of openness here at GPCOG and the willingness to advance the inclusion of underrepresented communities, we were able to create 2 seats on the regional transportation advisory committee, so that all community members can be also represented on those committees. So through the community transportation leaders, people advocate, they come with knowledge, they come with skills, but this program gives them a platform to express themselves. It gives them a chance to be on the table where decisions are made, but also they have the freedom to voice their opinion, to inform the plans, because those decisions affect them. So yeah, this is one of the program, but also we have the Ride With Me event, which is a program that GPCOG created just to enable decision makers, staff of municipalities, regional planners, and transit agencies staff to hear directly from community members by riding together public transit. So during that conversation, they come up with ideas about how to improve the system. It also helps decision makers to see things from the perspective of riders, which enables them to see how they can improve the system to work better for the users. That's another platform where it's another program that is open to all community members to join, and then advocate for those transportation, the Transportation Community Network, which is a network for that GPCOG created with our organization partners. We meet there, we talk about transportation, everything. All members of the public are welcome to join. They voice their opinion there. This is how we open doors to get people in, and then we reach people where they are. We are ready to support, to provide transportation, to pay the price, because involving people enables us to create plans that can be implemented. So yeah, that's how we have been. Those are kind of initiatives that are here in the region. And then for the travel helpers was created as model for our region, but it can be also replicated around the state of Maine. We recently presented it at the Moving Maine Network, so that as to share the experience, how our best practice here, to see if it can be replicated across the state. Yeah.
That was actually going to be one of my questions about how replicable it is, Marcel. But thanks for that. That was perfect. And you take that to another place. I think we've touched on this. Is the MaineDOT's workforce transportation program. I think there was an injection of $5 million from some of the recent funding coming out of the federal processes. My other notes here talk about a universal basic mobility program. I'm wondering if these are things that are underway in Maine and what they would look like, how they dovetail with smart growth and might promote smart growth, or at least transportation and smart growth policy. Again, related to, say, aging, different ages, job access, livability. Anybody can take this one.
I can speak directly to your first one, Carl,
Thanks,
the
Ryan.
workforce transportation pilot. MaineDOT was very fortunate to get $5 million through the governor's Maine Jobs and Recovery Plan, which ultimately came from federal ARPA funds. And that $5 million is for workforce transportation projects around the state. So it's a competitive grant program. Employers, nonprofits, municipalities, in some cases transit agencies are eligible to apply. And the idea is that there are folks that are willing and able to work. They just need help with transportation barriers connecting to where the job opportunities are. So folks may have seen that we awarded our first grant through the program last week to Sunday River up in Bethel. So it's a great program, but it's also opened up a lot of conversations for MaineDOT to be engaged with the private sector in connecting workers and potential workers to job opportunities. So this program started up in May of this year. We relaunched the Go Maine program that I mentioned earlier in conjunction with the Maine Turnpike Authority in April. So between those two programs, it's really opened up some avenues for us to engage on that workforce transportation piece of the equation, which, in the current environment we're in, we know there are folks that are struggling to find the job opportunities and make those connections. And then we also know that employers that are desperately looking for people to do the work. So we're very, very pleased to have made that first award. We have several other proposals that we're considering and are looking to make some other announcements in the coming weeks.
I'll just jump in real quick. I think in the same vein as it relates to equity and affordability, just by way of one example that we've deployed here in the PAX region is moving our fare payment system to something we call fare capping, which means we have done away with the kind of period passes and tickets that one would buy, say a 10 ride pass or a monthly pass that costs anywhere from $45 to $60 up front in order for you to have that not free, but have that at your disposal for the course of a month. And if you ride a lot, of course, that can be a good value. But that prices low-income people out of that market, so to speak, and they ended up paying, cash on a trip-by-trip basis. And at the end of the month, they would have spent more money than someone who could afford to pay $45 or $50 for a monthly pass up front. And so what we did here in the PAX region with 3 of the bus agencies, Metro, South Portland, and Bedford Saco, is moved to a fare capping system where it's a pay-as-you-go system. You do have to sort of load money onto an account. You have to have a smart card, or you can use a mobile app. We make sure the network to access those smart cards is very wide, so people who are unbanked or don't have a bank account can take cash into a CVS or a Walgreens and reload their card. We need to make sure they get the cards, but it really levels the playing field. The person making $15,000 a year, $20,000 a year, in the end is going to pay the same amount for transit and then pay less overall compared to someone who can afford that benefit. That's something that I hope that we advance aggressively here in the region and across the state, because it is an improvement in affordability and equity. And just along those lines, and I think Zoe may have mentioned this earlier, maybe before we got on the call, that we are working hard to try to put together a low-income pass program that would try to channel a lot of different funding sources that go into a lot of transportation benefits for people who are on GA assistance or other forms of assistance through the state or the federal government. Many people on the call probably know that they can get transportation benefits through a lot of different channels. There's a lot of rules around what they can use those benefits for. And at the end of the day, we want our low-income populations, those on GA assistance, to have just a very easy pass that they can use to get around. It should be that simple. And I'm hoping that we can work on that going forward.
And if I may, Carl, jump in to add that. So, I think when we talk about mobility management, and Marcel did name a lot of the programs that happen because of that in the GPCOG region. But it's really a flexible approach that can be used anywhere and would look different in different places. And I think a very appropriate role for mobility management is to work with developers, work with planners to help advance the inclusion of transportation issues as development's happening. And so, you know, I think having it be part of the conversation, I think that's, we don't really currently have a way of consistently connecting the dots. And, you know, for instance, Maine Housing, in some of the funding that they give out, they have a place where they, you know, you get extra points for being near transit. You get points for, you know, being in a place that provides demand response. But then there isn't necessarily like an entity or an organization that developers can say, hey, I want to do that. I want to do that well. Who can I work with? And I think that's so that's really part of the role that the Moving Maine Network is trying to play and looking to step into. And that affordability, when we work it out to get more people riding who really want to ride, that's a big infusion of cash into our transit systems, which then makes them better for everybody. I mean, as somebody who lives right near the routes that serve high schoolers in Portland, when the high school signed on to be a partner with transit in our city, we got more frequency. So, you know, it was really, really beneficial. So every time we get an institutional partner, we're getting better transit. And so that's something that I think we want people to really be thinking about and develop more ways to figure out ways for developers, probably, you know, on a smaller scale, to be able to invest in transit. I don't think we have that figured out yet, but I feel like that's a role for smart growth thinkers, is to help us figure out ways, like, is it a mini TIF or something that gets us that?
Well, I mean, this is a perfect segue, because my next couple of questions here, we only have a couple of minutes, but we'll take a little bit into the Q&A section here, which was again about partnerships and really the private sector in large employers or even small collections of employers. And whether or not this is at the state or community level, how do we better ensure access to community and public transit services through partnerships, through unique alliances? And, you know, what other ways, you know, shuttles, van pools, what are the opportunities for taking private funding to match with federal funding, or you know, what's happening along those lines? And are there opportunities there that anybody's working on that are coming down the line, or that have been done and could be expanded on? And there may not be many, but I just think that I really believe that this is an opportunity, because employees are desperate for workers right now, and workers are somewhat desperate for affordable transportation options or places to live. And I've heard of some examples I could talk about in New Hampshire, but just again, curious about in Maine or anything that's going on with this.
I'll start with a quick example. I've mentioned past programs a few times now, and I'll mention it again. I do think that's one of the most important things that employers, developers, any institution can do to help put free access or access to transit or other forms of alternative mobility into the hands of their students, their employees, et cetera. A relatively new iteration of this concept that we have been working on for years is that we have just signed a new partnership with the developers of Rock Row and Westbrook. You're probably familiar with the first phase of that development. That's where Market Basket is on the site. They're rapidly expanding, going into phase 2 and phase 3 with a lot more exciting things happening on that site. We worked with them to, I think, approve or advance the first partnership with a developer for a transit pass program, in which that developer is going to fund or cover the cost of the transit passes for all of their tenants, employees on that site, including the residential that's going to be going up too. Usually these programs are direct relationships with specific employers. So for example, we would go to Market Basket and see if we can get a pass program off the ground. No, this was with the developer, and it was tied to some of their incentives with the city of Westbrook and with Metro. And we did have some leverage in that instance, but it really is the first, I think, time that a developer has signed on to a pass program. And I think this can be repeated, replicated with other developments around the state, because I think if we can get the development communities, again, supporting transit and putting money behind incentivizing transit, in addition to all the parking they usually build, again, it puts free transit passes in the hands of many, many employees. And that's, I think, been our focus. And I think it's something that can be repeated, replicated across the state.
That's an awesome example, Greg. Curious about how that came about quickly. Were they incentivized to do it, or were, you know, how did the developer? It's very rare. That's an example I haven't heard of, and it's absolutely the level at which it should be done. Was it through the permitting process?
There's some uniqueness to our relationship with Rock Row, which gave us some leverage to convince them to advance that kind of program, which wouldn't always be the case across, you know, different towns, cities in the state, but certainly municipalities that are working with developers, when they go through the permitting process and the development review process, those municipalities can, you know, I think very simply require developers to work with whatever local transit agency or mobility management program is around, and essentially make this a requirement of getting their development approved. So I think, again, we'll be able to, I'm looking forward to reporting out on the success of this as Rock Row keeps developing out. And again, we hope to use it as an exemplar for other municipalities.
That's a great one. Thank you. Perfect. Anybody else want to comment on any of this at this point?
I'll just comment quickly,
thank you,
Carl,
Grant.
that the workforce transportation pilot program that I mentioned before, there's a 20% match requirement from the applicant. So that's one of the factors that we consider. And then the program is open to small businesses as well. But one of the first questions we ask them is, have you talked to other businesses around the area? So we're really looking to connect as many workers and potential workers to help as many businesses as possible. And then we also ask, have you already talked to your local transit provider to see if there's a solution that's readily available? And then if not, we'll look to explore options with them to try to find something that's the right size, but we want to make sure they're having those conversations at the local level first.
Great. That's great. These are great to hear. Thanks, Ryan. You know, here it is 5:39, and so we're into the more freelance open Q&A portion of the webinar this afternoon. So I've got some prompt questions here, but I don't know, Maggie, if you wanted to look at the questions that are in the chat.
Yeah, I know Lily had a comment, and if people just, it's a small group, so if people just want to raise their hand, and we can just do it that way. And it's if you hit reactions at the bottom of your screen, it's in there. But let's let Lily go first.
Hi, thank you, Maggie. I've never done a forum like this before, so bear with me. I am here representing a safety committee that was formed by myself in Westbrook. The call letters are WSMAC, which is Westbrook Safe Mobility and Access Committee. And I'm going to be sharing our page link before the meeting's over. I just wanted to say thank you all, because I am advocating for similar interests that everybody's been bringing up. Especially representing the disabled community. I actually wrote and said that my dream as an advocate is to see the able-bodied and disabled-bodied communities merge as one. A lot of disabled people don't speak out, like with the somebody said surfaces on sidewalks and stuff like that. We haven't spoken out about how a wheelchair is stuck on a sidewalk that's like broken into pieces and everything. I know Portland upgraded their sidewalks, and I'm so glad, because I used to get stuck. I use an electric wheelchair, and my front wheels would get stuck when the red bricks were like, had many gaps in it. You know, the disabled community needs a voice to be able to say to developers, hey, this is a great idea, but mobility and access wise, we need this. And that's what we're sharing in Westbrook. And I'm hoping to see this go all over the place. So I wanted to say thank you, everybody.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Lily. I know that when we did the roundabout over at USM, we worked very closely with some experts about, we worked with mobility impaired, wheelchair, and that was a big eye opener for all of us working on that, looking at accessibility in wheelchairs and wheeled vehicles. And sorry, were there any other questions? I can go into other questions, but I wanted to let those participants, if there are anyone else.
Craig asked in the chat, with Mobility Maine, do employers and or riders pay for the rides?
So I think that might be for me, and I'm a little, I'm wondering if we all sort of blended in there, because Moving Maine, we do advocacy and networking. We don't provide services.
I can speak up. It was my question.
Sure. Yeah.
There was so I guess I'm kind of interested in this whole, as I think of outside of Portland or Southern Maine, this issue about how people move around. And there was this discussion about private and public partnership and trying to get that sort of the workforce piece of it. And basically, it just wasn't really clear from that exactly how does it work? I mean, I can imagine a system where, the rides get set up and it's going to cost the employer a certain amount of money to kind of make that available to employees, or the riders would have some sort of discount. It just wasn't really clear. I was just trying to get clarification on that. So it actually wasn't about Moving Maine. It was about that workforce public-private partnership.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, I'll let Ryan take that one.
Yeah, that sounds like that might be the Go Maine program, which is the ride sharing trip planning program that I mentioned before. Craig, does that sound right?
Yeah, well, that wasn't it, but that's okay. I actually have a question about that. Maybe you can answer. I checked out the website and it's totally geared towards commuting. The website is the intention that the program would expand, because obviously transportation, getting groceries in a rural area can be a big deal. Is that program potentially something that might grow to provide mobility to more users, or is it intended to be focused on commuting?
Nope, the Go Maine program, first off, it is free to employers. It's funded through MaineDOT and the Maine Turnpike Authority. So that's where the funding comes from. And I should say it's free to organizations and users. So all those services are provided for free of charge. And then I'm sorry, what was the second piece of your question?
Just basically, if you look at the website, it's completely geared towards commuters. Is that the intent of the program, or is it intended to grow out from that?
That had been the intent and certainly the perception up until the last couple years. So we're trying to move away from that perception. And you may have heard me say employers myself. So we're moving away from that. So it's all organizations, anyone that needs a ride for any purpose, to help them make connections to options that can meet their needs. So, the sort of perception out there is that it's exclusively for commuters. A lot of folks associated it with Southern Maine, but it really is for any trips that folks might need to make around the state.
And I would just jump in with an interesting partnership that is bubbling up around Go Maine, because I agree, when you look at it, it's still like the word commuter is very prominent. But there's this conversation with the Maine Council on Aging and some other age-friendly groups are doing work around bolstering the volunteer driver programs around the state. and making it easier to figure out who serves your area, and looking at, is there a way to have the services listed in Go Maine, and that you might actually connect with them through that site? Because I don't know if folks utilize them at all right now, but it often tends to be word of mouth. You kind of stumble onto that there you have a great program in your area, but and sometimes they even are worried, they don't want to promote themselves too widely because they're afraid they wouldn't be able to handle don't have the capacity to meet the need. But so there is a capacity building effort that Maine Council on Aging is heading up that's I think has potential to take it in that direction. And I think we're still lacking like a real one-stop shop where you can see every option that you have in Maine, in terms of what, not just transit, but also the volunteer rides and the paratransit. And but I think there's a few different groups who are working on it at the same time, and hopefully it's going to kind of meld together into some good resources. I'll put a few things in the chat that might be helpful for folks who are looking for more information.
Okay, thanks everyone. Did I miss any other questions from the chat? Kind of the last bit here with the remaining 6-7 minutes we had.
So Will does have his hand up, so.
Thank you. Okay.
Hi all. I'm just curious. I'm coming at it from the decarbonization and environment perspective, how that frames into all of these plans. Reducing emissions through these programs. How it's kind of a general question. How does that fit the picture here?
I'm sorry. I didn't think I was muted. I think as far as with vehicles, and number one, you get cars off the road, the existing fleet, which is primarily emitting carbon. I know, and I'll let Greg speak to it a little bit. In Portland, and I think in other places, and I know the state's kind of got this going as well, there's a push towards electric vehicles, electric buses, and I know that a handful of them were recently deployed in Portland. Is that right, Greg? Or was it down at Bedford Saco?
Yeah, I mean, from two perspectives. I mean, obviously there's the good work of trying to reduce vehicle miles traveled, move people from automobiles onto transit, so that we are obviously spewing fewer greenhouse gas emissions into our atmosphere that's causing climate change. And so certainly all of our work to try to expand transit and improve the availability of transit, the accessibility, the affordability, all these things that we have been talking about are meant to help with that particular problem. Maine won't wait. The state's plan for cutting greenhouse gas emissions by a large percentage by 2050, I think 85% by 2050, is based on that goal, along with statewide, electrification of our automobile fleets, which of course is a very tall order. But within that, of course, is the work among the transit fleets here in the state to try to electrify their transit fleets. And as Carl mentioned, my organization, Greater Portland Metro, along with Bedford Saco Old Orchard Beach Transit, have launched some of the first electric vehicles in at least 2 decades here in the region. And so far, they are performing well. And we have to get through our first winter here because the cold weather really does kind of zap their vehicle ranges. And that's important because the extent to which we can run these vehicles all day and at an electricity rate that is affordable for us, that's going to help us with our transition to electric vehicles over the next 15 or 20 years. And so the better the ranges of these vehicles, the lower the cost from CMP, Central Maine Power, in terms of charging, that's going to allow us to transition faster rather than slower.
Right, thanks. Anybody else want to comment on that? I think,
I had one thing I wanted to add, Carl, that
please.
the Moving Maine Network, and I'll put this sign up in the chat, but we convene a monthly learning community, and our topic on November 30th is about equity in the transition to electric vehicles. So we'll have folks from Efficiency Maine talking about subsidy programs and kind of, you know, getting feedback on, I know many folks want e-bikes to be added. And, you know, so we'll have opportunity to give input. And then also Jill Johanning from Alpha One talking about, handling accessibility with electric vehicles. So making sure that charging stations work for people with disabilities and, you know, and all the parts there. So I think, you know, there are a lot of questions about how do we get electric vehicles into households that have much lower incomes. And so I think, you know, I would invite folks to be part of that conversation, because we're hopeful as Moving Maine that it doesn't have, you know, we want it to be both and, not either or. But the reality for many families right now is that it's not, if they're getting a personal vehicle, it's not going to be an electric one. So how do we change that? I mean, and sorry, for folks with very low incomes, I'm saying.
Yeah, I know in Portland, the bike share program recently was launched, and a part of that program includes electric bikes. I think, you know, as far as providing access to, instead of having to buy your own bike, that linked up with being able to, you know, it's a form of microtransit, get to whatever the transit may be, whether or not it's fixed route or a demand response or something else in between. We've got a couple more minutes here, and unless anybody else has another question, I've got.
We do. We have one more from Paul,
Thank
and
you.
then Kristen has one more.
Oh yeah, I see them both. Yeah.
Hey, good evening. Thank you. Just wanted to make sure that everyone had an opportunity to get eyes on the active transportation arterials plan that's been published by the Maine Trails Coalition. I'll drop that in the chat. There's also a suggested plan for an arterials connection map in the greater Portland area. So I'll put that in the chat. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Kirsten?
Hi, everyone. I don't think I've heard anyone talk about workforce challenges in terms of the transportation workforce. It's in the news a lot, shortage of bus drivers, but I was wondering if folks could speak more broadly to the needs in the sector, you know, maybe beyond just bus drivers, but across the many different jobs and ideas about how to deal with that.
Greg, you want to go first, or whoever?
Yeah, I can start. It's certainly like many sectors, it's been a challenge for us across almost all of our categories of employment, but certainly bus drivers and maintenance staff have been the hardest to recruit. There is sort of I would say almost a structural problem in the country with respect to hiring CDL licensed bus drivers who want to do this work. The workforce tends to be a little bit older, and so nationally and in this state too, I mean, they're sort of transitioning out of the work, and it's sort of hard to encourage young people to kind of come into this line of work. There are some barriers to of course getting a CDL license. There's obviously the current labor market is obviously under very high pressure across the country, but in Maine. And so the way we're responding, quite frankly, is with raising wage rates. That's really the main thing that we can do and have control over. We do our best to make sure that the job of bus driving is as enticing as it can be. It is a challenging job, and so getting the right person who can handle that heavy piece of machinery and be a great customer service agent, which is what you want, is kind of a tall order. So it is challenging. I don't have a silver bullet. It's just, I think, you know, a living wage, a good living wage, and obviously making sure people are a part of the buy into the value of providing that service to the community. So that culture is important too to create.
I just had if I could, Carl, really quickly.
Yeah, thanks, Greg, and go
at
ahead,
the-
Ryan.
At the state level, we hear from providers like Greg all around the state that this is a huge challenge, not just with drivers, but with other staff. And as we're moving towards electrification and, more use of technology in the public transportation world, the skill sets are going to be changing as well. So at the state level, we're doing our best to kind of quantify what the challenges are and the impact that is having on public transportation operations in the state, and then exploring whether there's anything we might be able to do at the state level. So we're in very preliminary sort of conversations with the providers, and maybe able to explore something with the community college system, for example, at a state level. But early in the process at this point of just quantifying where we are in terms of the challenge.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm out of time, but I do want to ask one more question. Hopefully you've got a fairly quick answer. I think it's primarily for you, Ryan, which is, with the state plan, transit plan, I think it's concluding or wrapping up soon. Does that plan talk about ways to increase state funding? For those who aren't aware, Maine, I think, is either second or tied with New Hampshire for the least amount of transit funding per capita nationwide. And so it's a huge barrier. And then we're a big dispersed state of, broad geography. Any hope there, Ryan, that may help with everything we've been talking about for the last hour and a bit?
Yeah, I'll just mention there's a survey that comes out every year where every department of transportation across the country is asked to submit how much state funding they provide for public transportation. There's a lot of discrepancy and sort of gray area, and kind of judgment calls by each department of what they include in there. So depending on which year you're looking at, we perform better or worse, depending on which year you're looking at and what's being counted in there. But to Carl's major point, we're towards the lower end of the spectrum, regardless of how you look at it. We know we need more public transportation funding, but one thing we're hoping that the transit plan, which will be coming out in a couple of weeks, will help us to kind of pinpoint is how much funding and what do we want to accomplish with that funding. So rather than just making a push for more transit funding, we'd like to be able to pinpoint as much as possible what the system will look like and the types of investments and upgrades and challenges that we're hoping to address going forward. So it's more than just funding for funding's sake. It's what do you want to do with that funding?
It makes perfect sense. I'm looking forward to taking a look at that plan. With that, I think we're out of time. Thanks, Ryan, Marcel, Greg, Zoe, Maggie, you want to wrap it up here?
Yeah, I share thanks to all of our panelists and to Carl and to Nancy Smith, our executive director, for all their help with putting this on, and to Marcus Miller. He's on our events committee. He can't be here tonight, but he was a huge help in planning this as well. And just a reminder that we did record this and we'll be posting it to our YouTube and social media pages. And I hope everybody has a nice evening and a great long weekend.
Yeah, Maggie, and just sorry to have the last word here. Would it be possible to include all these links in an email to all the participants?
I think we can do that. Nancy, I know, said earlier that we're going to be saving the chat so we can share them.
Perfect. Yeah, so there you go, everyone. In case you didn't write every one of these connections, these links down. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.